This is the second installment of our series that we decided to do here on agricultural water. I'm Lisa McCaig. I'm part of the UMass vegetable team. My colleague Sue Schäufele is here also. She's going to help do run some of the logistics with me tonight. So here is our agenda for the evening. We have a couple of four speakers actually tonight. We have Vandana is a late entry onto the agenda, so she might not have appeared or wouldn't have appeared on the original agenda that we put out. But a couple of folks from the state, Michael Botelho from the MDAR Purdue Safety Program, who many of you I'm sure know. And he's just going to give hopefully a little update on there's new regulations that follow the federal regulations for produce safety inspections in the state, and there are some water related components to those regulations, and hopefully he'll just give you a little update about that. I actually don't know, I didn't look if he's on here yet, if I should call him out, but Michael, you can speak up if you're on.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then Vandana Rao, did I pronounce your last name correctly? Thank you, from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, to talk tonight about the Massachusetts, the Drought Task Force in response to the drought in the state. And so we'll hear from both Michael and Vandana, and there'll be time for questions after each speaker period. So after that, we'll do some questions, and then that'll be followed by, I'm really excited that we have some, as much as this COVID situation is frustrating, it has given us the opportunity to reach out to some farther afield colleagues. And so I'm really excited to welcome Scott Monroe from Purdue Extension to talk about water sampling and risks to surface water and other water sources for irrigation and other things on the farm. And then that again will be followed by questions, and then Phil Tocco from Michigan State University to walk us through how to put together a water distribution system map and do some inspections. Pretty excited about that. They're both great educators. I'm really happy to have them here. And I think we are ready to go. I can get that. Oh, that's a little sneak peek. I will stop sharing, and Vandana, you're welcome to share your screen, and then I don't know what order you guys want to do it, and maybe I'll leave it between the two of you, but Michael, if you want to speak up first, or.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I don't want to take too much time. Just to provide a general update, we did obviously close out the public hearing for our food safety regulations. That's in support of our statutory authority that references the produce safety rule in Massachusetts. So I'm excited to reach that milestone. I'll be putting together a hearing officer report and submitting that, and we should be moving the regulations along. What does that mean for the growers on the call? Not much has changed with the way that we are operating and conducting both inspections and or audits in the space. We're still waiting on some updates for the water rule under FSMA, so we won't talk about that right now. For the audit program, we're still maintaining the audit requirements consistent with similar audit programs like the USDA Harmonized Gap program. So not wanting to take too much time with not much to say, I think it's best I turn it over to Vandana, who is our task force coordinator at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And I'm sure she'll pique your interest with some information as to what the task force provides. Vandana, if you're ready.
Didn't realize I was on mute. Thank you so much, Michael and Lisa, for having me here. Appreciate taking some of your time and being invited. It is at the most probably opportune moment because of the drought that we are currently experiencing across the state. And I know that some farmers have been experiencing some impacts from these drying conditions. So the idea behind coming here and talking to all of you was really to provide some information on who declares drought in the state, who is paying attention to this, what do we look at, and what is the mechanism or avenue for us to get information from you on impacts that you are experiencing, It could be small or large. Either way, we do want to hear from you because that provides us with sort of a priority of where we need to focus either our outreach or our technical assistance or our financial assistance. We look at existing financial programs and any new ones that we could potentially create. Some of you may remember back from 2016, 2017, when we had our last fairly intensive drought. At that point of time, the state did make grants and loans available, including the federal government as well. And I know several folks in the community did take advantage of those. So it is very, very helpful for us to hear from you. So I'm hoping this is the beginning of a channel of communication between all of you and the state. Obviously, you're already in touch with UMass and Extension as well as with DAR, but you should also know that the Secretary's office as well as the governor is very much in tune with and wants to hear about impacts that you are experiencing on the ground. So let me quickly, and I want more time for sort of question and answer and sort of engagement. So I'm going to quickly just give you a broad overview of where we're at and what we look at. The state updated its drought plan last year. I would say that the 2016-2017 intensive drought that we had was really sort of the genesis of some of our thinking on what aspect of the old drought plan really desperately needed an update. Part of it was the methodology, so that now after our update, we're able to track and assess and declare droughts sooner. So if some of you may remember in 2016, we very quickly got into a drought before even it was declared. And part of it was our old methodology was not sensitive enough. So we've sort of updated those aspects. We've updated aspects of our drought actions and put in more about coordination among state agencies and when and where to pull in the feds for assistance and both financial and technical. So we look at 6 indices to tell us whether there is a drought. Obviously, precipitation or rain is the main one. Are we getting enough rain or not? Should we be getting X amount of rain at this time of year? And what are we getting compared to what we normally get at that time of year? That's sort of our broad general approach to all our indices, be it precipitation, stream flow, groundwater, lakes and impoundments, fire danger, or crop moisture. The idea is, how are we doing today compared to where we should be? And how off are we? So is the deficit 10, 20, 30, 40, 50%? And it's, we look at it from that perspective that it starts to tell us sort of the intensity or the severity, as well as the fact that we are outside what would be considered as normal. So we look at all these indices, and based on the levels of those indices, we actually can determine what a drought level a particular region in the state is at. So we have 4 levels of drought. Level 0 is normal, and we go from level 1, which is a mild drought. Level 2 is a significant drought. Level 3, a critical drought. And level 4 is an emergency drought. Obviously, we don't want to ever get to that emergency drought condition, because then we know that there are huge impacts, not just to your community, the farming community, but to water supply. Obviously, the environment suffers heavily by that point of time. Rivers and streams are drying up. Fish kills are likely going to be seen, and so on and so forth. So what do we do as a state or as local municipalities to help us mitigate the impacts of this drought so we don't sort of get to that level 4 and can sort of mitigate the impacts early on, so we can sort of ride through this dry period? Okay, so we have 7 regions across the state, and this map here shows the regions along with the county maps. You may be more familiar with which county you're in and may think in those terms, even for some of the management decisions that are probably made at the state and federal level. But so we have the Western region, Connecticut River Valley regions, Central region, Northeast, Southeast, Cape Cod, and then the islands as a separate region. So for each of these regions, we look at each of those 6 indices that I just showed you on stream flow, precipitation, and so on. So who makes this call? There is a very scientific and a very thought-through process of this. We have a drought management task force that has been set up in the state. It's been functioning for about 20 years now. Was set up in the early 2000s in response to the drought that the state experienced back then. And it's chaired by EEA as well as MEMA. MEMA really plays a critical role in coordinating and connecting with the municipalities, but really we take advantage of their networking and their sort of the emergency management sort of critical functions when conditions start to get bad and we need to mobilize our resources to help farmers or local municipalities or even private well owners. So on this task force, there are several state agencies, and the task force is really meant to be a body that looks at the data, looks at the impacts, and recommends drought levels for each of those regions. So the state agencies include DEP, DCR, that's Conservation and Recreation, Department of Fish and Game, Department of Agricultural Resources, Department of Public Health, quasi-government entity, Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, and DPU, which is the Department of Public Utilities. So all of these have some function and authority over some aspect of water resources or regulate water resources in some way. And the federal agencies really provide us with a lot of really solid technical information. The U.S. Geological Survey, as well as National Weather Service, and the River Forecasting Center in particular. We have USDA and the Army Corps as well on the task force. In addition, we have a few other partners that work on water resources or work with stakeholders that care about water resources or work with the water in terms of water suppliers. So we have the Water Supply Citizens Advisory Committee, WSCAC, that's based out in Western Mass. The Mass Water Works Association that represents the water suppliers and sort of the environmental consulting community. And the Mass Rivers Alliance that represents all the environmental sort of watershed groups. So these members talk about or bring to the task force input, data, impacts that they are experiencing or are hearing from their stakeholders on the ground. So these are the types of topics that we discuss at task force meetings. Obviously, hydrological conditions or water conditions. What's the weather and forecast going to be like? For example, if you're having a 2-week dry period, but we know that it's going to rain heavily over a weekend, we may, at a meeting on a Thursday, for example, shy away from calling a drought because we know it's going to rain and there's going to be sustained rainfall over 2, 3, 4 days, and likely those drying conditions will abate. Once we are squarely within a drought, then our determination of whether we move from one level to another does take forecast into consideration as well. We also get reports on water supply impacts, impacts on environmental resources like wetlands, fisheries, streams, headwater streams, any endangered species perhaps, nutrient impacts, obviously agricultural impacts. Our colleagues at DAR provide that feedback to us at those task force meetings. Fire danger is a critical part of what we look at more and more as conditions are getting dry. The fire danger levels and potential is increasing, and that has huge impacts on water, whether there is enough water available in those communities to meet those fire threats. Then engineering and infrastructure impacts, and finally public health impacts. So here is our broad process. So state staff look at the data on those indices. We do our analysis. There's a lot of statistics that's involved to know where we are at, and we analyze and present the data at the task force meeting. The task force shares additional information on the ground, impacts, forecasts, local impacts, additional data that they may have that we don't have access to. Then the task force deliberates for each of those regions. Hey, okay, in the Western region, stream flow looks like it's at a level 2, precipitation is a level 2, groundwater is still at level 1, it hasn't quite caught up. Fire danger is at 3, crop moisture is at 3. So what should we, what level of drought should we recommend for this region? So it's a deliberative process. Professional judgment obviously plays a big role, and where exactly all these indices fit. Then once they land by consensus on any particular level at a region, through me to the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, they make a recommendation on what the level should be. The Secretary takes that and other things into consideration, and then is the person that makes the drought declaration for the state. And we put that out in the form of a press release. So a day or two after our task force meetings, typically a press release goes out announcing the drought, along with a bunch of information on what can be done at the local level, at the state level to help mitigate it, and also for residents. So again, these are our drought levels, 0 to 4, normal, mild drought, significant drought, critical, and emergency. So just to give you some quick sense of our data, I don't want to get into too much detail on this. I really want to be able to hear from you as well and answer any questions. But just to give you an idea of how much data we have. So all of those round circles you see are data points where we get information on precipitation or rainfall across the Commonwealth. So there are quite a few. We are well represented in all our regions. And I've put both the month of July and August just so you have a sense of how our precipitation was doing over those 2 months. The darker the red and orange color, the more impacted or the less the rainfall was. The green and blues show that there's plenty of rainfall above normal. Similarly for stream flow, here is our spread of data points. We look at every one of them, and cumulatively for a region, we'll come up with a level for stream flow. And the really dark dots that you see at the bottom here show record lows. So it's at the 0 to 2nd percentile, so it's only 0 to 2% of the times that it's ever reached this level. So it's really, really low in those areas. And then the reds are the next level up, then orange, and then this particular peachish color, and then anything that's green here is a normal condition. So as you can see, between July and August, conditions have worsened. And so this is a good comparison for us to look at each month so we know what the trend is, which way are we heading. Similarly for groundwater, we have a bunch of data points here as well, and some record low levels in groundwater here. Here's some of our data for lakes and impoundments. These are basically, many of them are natural lakes, and some of them are man-made lakes and impoundments or water supply related. But they do give us a sense of how these water bodies track with respect to how they normally would be in a non-drought condition. All right, some of this may affect you as well in your communities. The drought, sort of the fire index, so the numbers in red that you see, the higher the numbers means the higher the fire danger. So we look at this with our fire marshal who's at DCR, and they do these calculations almost on a daily basis, and we take a really hard look at drying conditions vis-a-vis fire and how much more of an elevated risk there is in any particular part of the state. And so what kind of messaging do we need to put out there for residents and others in terms of how they're using fire outdoors for their grills or other burning that they may do. So finally, this is where we're at. We take all of that data into consideration and we come out with a map, which is part of the declaration that the Secretary makes. So right now, every one of the 7 regions of the state is in a level 2 significant drought. So this is where we are at. Basically, this calls for heightened awareness for a lot of water conservation that we're expecting people to do both indoors as well as outdoors. This is for non-essential water use. And even on essential water use, we're asking people to be really mindful of their water use. So this is what came out earlier this month. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about some of the outreach we've been doing and some of the funding that generally is available. So let me first hit the outreach. So a lot of people ask us, okay, we're in a level 2 drought. What does this really mean? What does it mean to me as an individual resident? Or we have many concerned citizens that reach out to us saying, what can I do? Or what should I be doing in my home? So we created some of these outreach materials this year, using a design firm that thinks way more creatively than I do, for sure, or many of the technical staff and the state agencies do, sort of to put out images in a simple, succinct, yet sort of eye-catching type of format. So our idea was to put out the map and to talk about what this really means for us to be in a level 2 drought. And at the bottom, you see, what can you do? So it talks about temporarily limiting installation of new landscapes, limiting outdoor watering, and just minimizing overall water use. So we have something like this for each of our drought levels. We've also put out tips for saving water. Now, this does not apply to the agricultural sector, of course, but it does apply to sort of the residential as well as the commercial sector that may be using water outdoors. So limiting water outdoors during a drought, we really want people to not think about their landscapes drying as being a reason to put more water to make your grass look greener or your landscapes to spruce back up, because we're already stressing our water resources during a drought. How do you minimize landscape water? Part of it is also means you have better soils. You move to more drought-resistant plants so that they can continue to flourish and look nice even during drying conditions. And finally, minimizing use of water outdoors for other purposes that people may use it for. Here are some tips for indoor water use. We don't often think about these types of things, but a really good catchphrase that I learned from my kids was a song, I think, from either Sesame Street or one of those, where they would sing, "Never let the water run," all the time. So I've sort of caught on to that phrase even now when my kids are teenagers, to remind them of that, that wonderful phrase that they learned in kindergarten about not running their tap while they're brushing their teeth, or happen to be just staring at their face in the mirror. So this is something that we put out there for communities to use. And we've also created some social media assets. So we're very excited about this. Any of you or municipalities or a watershed group, anybody that wants to put this message out or any of our messages on water conservation can freely download and use this for your own Instagram posts or Facebook posts or newsletters or any of that. So we have decided to take on the onus of creating this water conservation material rather than every community spending a lot of money, which they don't have, on hiring a consultant to do this. So we're developing a new website to specifically put this information for anybody to use. So here are just a few examples. I'm putting a couple more. Again, those are not necessarily targeted to the agricultural community, but we can certainly do that. If there are things that any of you feel would be helpful for you, we'd be happy to work with either UMass or Michael at DAR to come up with a few social media products that can be used widely for the agricultural sector. So just a little bit on the funding, and I put the Food Security Infrastructure Grant Program here because that was a pot of money that was available this year. And I think if Michael, you may want, if you can unmute yourself, maybe you can talk a little bit about this grant program and what it was generally meant for, and that it was also sort of put out for drought-related projects.
I mean, I could definitely talk about the Food Security Infrastructure Grant Program and its relation to drought impacts, as well as a few other grant programs that we have at the department on a continuing basis that could also serve to provide funds to the space for water-related issues, particularly drought management. So for the Food Security Infrastructure Grant Program that was launched mainly for the food system in response to the COVID-19 impacts in Massachusetts, I think the fund was $36 million that just closed on the 15th of September. From what I understand, it's been very well prescribed. We have currently, I think, over 900 pending grant applications to review and get out. And there is a subset of those 900 that were specific to the impacts of the drought. That was opened up sort of late in the RFR, about 2 weeks before the end. And those will be ranked separately, obviously not in alignment with the original intent of the RFR, but based on the impact of the drought to those organizations that did apply. We do have a few other grants like AEP, that's our Agricultural Environmental Enhancement Program, as well as ACRES, which is our climate resiliency, that we do usually work with the executive office to fund and put those grants out on an annual basis. And those do provide grant assistance and then technical assistance when we're able to provide it for farms looking to mitigate some of these impacts of the drought or implement water management systems, those sort of things on farms. So we have that information available. I know UMass has access to that information as well, and it's posted on several websites. And if you have any questions specific, you can reach out obviously to me or Lisa and Sue and the team at UMass, and we'll be able to direct you to those resources and when they become available. So.
All right, great. Thank you, Michael. Just wanted to quickly talk about the MVP, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grants. About 11 to 12 million or so goes out from our office each year for a whole host of issues at the local level, and some of that could go towards water conservation. And then we have the DEP Water Management Act grants. And at this point in time, I'm going to hand it over to Dwayne to talk a little bit about the Water Management Act, the permitting program, and some of the regulatory sort of scheme around that and how it intersects with the agricultural sector. So Dwayne, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. As Vandana said, we meet when we're in a drought, so as we are now, and Michael mentioned this call, and I thank you for letting me jump in here just to kind of remind folks of the Water Management Act. So the Water Management Act, which was passed in the 1980s, it's Mass General Law 21G, and our regulations are 310 CMR 36. It says that anybody who withdraws water, whether from wells or surface water, that cumulatively exceed 100,000 gallons per day on average over 3 consecutive months needs DEP approval to do that. So, you know, people are probably withdrawing more than they normally do. I don't know how much you're using at this point in time, but if you think you're close to those numbers, you should really check in with me to talk about getting a water management permit. As far as evaluating how much water you use, most farmers don't meter, but if you got metered information, that's preferred. If you don't, then a detailed water use log. So, you know, I run 5 hours a day and my pump capacity is 200 gallons per minute and I use X on this day. That would suffice to kind of get some estimate as to what your water use is. Vandana, flip next slide. So the way we assess that 100,000 gallons per day is by basin. So you might have multiple fields and properties across the watershed. If they are all in one, it's the cumulative pumping from all of those that would dictate whether you need a permit. And here's our statewide map. I'm happy to get into more detail. So folks, if you're questioning whether you're on the line and where the withdrawals are, feel free to reach out to me. Next. So the Water Management Act, our universe of uses. So we register users across the state. Registered users are people who historically were withdrawing their water in the 1980s. You had to apply for a registration in the 1980s. We have 850 of those across the state. Currently, we have 28 farms that have been registered since the 1980s with us. And we have 340 cranberry growers who withdraw and are registered as well. The conditions on registrations are pretty minimal. They need to tell us how much water they use each year. They file an annual report with us, and they estimate or they meter that information. Folks who didn't register or are new to the system are permittees that you'll need to get a permit. We have 350 of those across the state. We have 4 farms that have permits, and we have 41 cranberry growers with permits. So a permit review process is a more involved process. We would look assessing what the potential impacts are. A permit's good for 20 years, and we review them. We try to review them every 5. They are potentially subject to conditions. So for example, if there are concerns about withdrawals on a stream or a pond, they may have conditions saying at certain levels that that pumping needs to be reduced or stopped. Most of our water is allocated through the registrations going way back. And we can't permit over a value that's over a safe yield. So that safe yield's a pretty complicated subject. I can tell you at this point, we have not exceeded safe yield in any of those 28 watersheds. We have a couple that are over, but we have ways to work on that. So my message today was not to scare folks, but to just remind you that there are some potential regulatory issues you may need to address. And I can tell you during a drought is frequently when I get contacted by people who have concerns about low stream flow. They're seeing people withdrawing that maybe never did, or they're very concerned about water. So, now is a good time just to reach out to you and remind you that we exist. And if you have any questions, next slide, please. Absolutely feel free to, go to DEP's website where you can read up on the permitting process and the guidance there. But even quicker than that, feel free to contact me and I can talk to you about the permit process and answer any other questions you have. And here's my information. So thank you. I appreciate giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Dwayne. So I think I have only one last slide, which is our contact information. I do want to sort of hand it over to Lisa, maybe to filter any questions that we have. Happy to answer any of those. I would love to hear from you, if not today, then anytime in the future. So please should take my email address down. If and when you have any or are experiencing any impacts from the drought. We are in the process of developing a drought impact reporting system that we'll make available online on our website. And it really is meant for all of you to use as a mechanism to get to us. So if you, it's not live as yet, we're still developing it with Cornell University. Once it's up and running, I can certainly let Michael and Lisa know so we can spread that information around. But the idea is to have a single portal where we start to receive information on any kinds of impacts that are being experienced out there, be it by a farmer or a private well owner in a resident or a commercial area or an entire subdivision. Sometimes they're all seeing low flow or low quantities of water in their wells. So that information will be made available to you. But until then, please do reach out to me by email if you're experiencing any of those kinds of conditions. Hand it over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you so much, Vandana. I appreciate that. So we are it's time to start to have Scott start his presentation. So there's not a lot of time for questions, although in the chat box there was one question and it was answered. It was for Dwayne, and he did put in an answer to that. Actually, it looks like there's another question in there as well that Dwayne might be for you. And so if you want to just sort of view that question and answer, does the Water Management Act apply to artesian water or surface water? And Dwayne answers that yes, it does apply to surface water withdrawals, and that artesian conditions may be applicable. And Patrick also asks, in addition to installing flow meters, should I also measure the standing height of my artesian well? So I don't know if Dwayne, you want to just quickly chime in.
I think I'd want to know more about it's something we probably should talk about.
Yeah, great. So certainly if you have other questions, direct them to Dwayne or Vandana if applicable there. And I know that we had talked in the flyer, advertised that Michael was going to talk about the produce safety components, water components of the produce safety rule. And I think based on just time, if people have specific questions, certainly they can direct them to me and I can redirect them to Michael. Or the next couple of segments will be about water testing and water maps and inspections. And so certainly if there are questions, Michael, that people have about how these things apply in Massachusetts, it'd be great if you wanted to chime in there, people can continue to put whatever questions they might have about these things in the chat, and we'll answer them here or afterwards if need be. Okay, so I think with that, I would love to move on to welcome Scott Monroe from Purdue University. And Scott, you should be able, if you have slides, to be able to share your screen. And just thank you again to Dwayne and Vandana for talking about the drought. It's a hugely important issue right now. And so I was really wanting to make sure that you guys could talk about that task force and what you're doing to address the issue. So
thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, can you all hear me?
There you are, yeah.
Awesome, that's our first challenge. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Right. And let's see here. You should see my first slide. Can you see that?
Yes, we do. And
All right.
I don't know if you
Oh,
want
yeah, I can see your notes too.
to.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see here. How's that?
Better.
All right. I love it when a plan comes together, right? Okay, well, good evening from Southwest Indiana. My name's Scott Monroe, and I am a food safety educator with Purdue University Extension, which means that basically I'm stationed down here in the southwestern part of the state in our melon producing region, and spend most of my time working with produce growers with regard to food safety, third-party audits, produce safety rule, et cetera. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about water sources, sampling, and test interpretation. Of course, all of this is going to be presented from a food safety standpoint. So let's get started. First off, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone that water is one of the major sources of contamination for fresh fruits and vegetables. Water is an excellent vector. Some of the pathogens that we see in the water include E. coli, Salmonella, Cryptosporidium. All of these can be transported by water. So again, it becomes very, very important for us to be aware of what the condition of our water is, what the quality is, and how we're using that water on the farm. One of the things that we run into is that, we see water creating issues, but a lot of it is because we use water for so many things on the farm, for irrigation, obviously, but also for pesticide sprays, frost protection, et cetera, et cetera. The list could potentially be endless. So when we look at water, we generally break it down into three sources that we talk about, and each one carries its own degree of risk. We talk about surface water, which basically that's ponds, ditches, streams, rivers, anything that's unprotected, that's open to the environment. We talk about wells, or what we call groundwater, which can be open or capped. And then we talk about municipal or rural water systems, what we in Indiana refer to as city water. So when we talk about municipal water systems, they're really the least likely to be contaminated because legally water must be potable before it is sold through the municipalities. So what we recommend for growers is that if you are using municipal water or water sourced from a municipality, the easiest way to manage that risk or to show that you've managed that risk is to basically just go down to the office or to the municipal offices, request a copy of their most recent water test, at least annually, and keep that on file to show that the water you're using has been tested. When we talk about groundwater, we're talking about wells, occasionally springs. The idea is that we protect these water sources, which means we don't mix pesticides or other chemicals near the well. We don't apply solid manure near the well. We make sure we use backflow prevention devices, check valves. If we have a well that we're not using, we want to make sure that thing is properly capped. Keep livestock away from the active recharge areas as best we can. And sometimes when you're dealing with a neighbor's property and their livestock, that may or may not be something you're going to do very easily. And we also recommend that folks inspect wells annually. Surface water is really our most likely to be contaminated. And the reason for that is because you simply can't control, for the most part, what's flying over it or what's swimming in it. Very open to the environment. So again, surface water is seen to carry the most risk for contamination, or to have the most risk of having some type of contaminant within it. So again, surface water is the one we really focus on in terms of looking at risk and managing our risk of contamination. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing we want to do is keep livestock out of water sources and drainages to water. And this can be challenging in our area because a lot of the ponds and lakes that we have are fed by runoff. So if the neighbor has cattle, half a mile up the road in the waterway, it becomes very hard to prevent that from running off into the pond or lake that we're wanting to use for production. So again, we try to keep the livestock out of the water with the understanding that sometimes that may be easier said than done. If we are using manure in our production, we want to apply it away from the surface water. We want to manage our storage, our compost runoff. And that may mean upgrading septic or sewage systems. I know in a lot of the rural areas, in Indiana, we still have a lot of the older systems that haven't connected to a municipality where that is a concern, where there may be some contamination leaching from some of these older systems. So we always try to be cognizant of that. When we're irrigating or using water, we really want to be cognizant of how we're using that water and whether it's contacting the edible portion of the crop or the plants, or if it's under the soil or under the soil surface. So we always want to ask ourselves how we're irrigating, how's that going to affect our food safety? Generally, if we're using drip irrigation, especially coupled with plastic mulch, that tends to be seen as having the lowest or least amount of risk for contamination of crops, mostly because that water is not contacting the plant or the edible portion of the crop. As we get into flood irrigation or overhead irrigation, because that water does contact the edible portion of the crop, that's kind of seen as having higher risk for a contamination event to take place. So basically, if there's one or two things, take-home messages from this, it would be that first, if you're sourcing your water from surface water, that's probably going to be incur greater risk than any other water source. And also the other take-home is with irrigation. The more you can decrease the amount of contact between the water and the plants, the more you're going to reduce the risk of any potential contamination event happening. So we want to talk a little bit about water testing. What it is, what it isn't, what they do, and all that good stuff. So we recommend that produce growers test their water. Now that, whether you're legally obligated to do so or not, test your water. Water tests are used to track water quality, not necessarily for daily monitoring. I know most of these tests, you're going to have water tested. In our area, you're looking at $30 to $50 for a test. So, if I had to use that for daily monitoring, I probably wouldn't be in business for too long. But we use that test to track water quality. And then our records of water testing over time, we use that to establish patterns, which can be very useful as we're monitoring water quality, because a change in pattern may indicate a problem or possible fecal contamination. Yes, he's going there and talking about that at the time when most of us are thinking about eating supper. Fecal contamination. All right, so anyway, but we use the water testing to see that pattern so that if we see any outliers, we can start investigating what that problem might be. How often do we test? Generally for surface water, we want to see that tested at least once before you use it in the spring, and then regularly during use. You could go monthly or as much as you can bear, or as required by regulation or by your certifying agency if you're doing a third-party GAPS audit. Well water, groundwater, we really like to see that tested at least yearly and before use, or of course, as required by regulation. And then the municipal water, again, in general, it's just a case of obtaining a copy of the water test from the municipality that from which you're purchasing water. Questions: where do we collect samples? Surface and groundwater, take a representative sample appropriate for the water source. Well, that's informative, isn't it? Okay, so if we're looking at surface water, generally we're going to, if we're using out of a creek or a stream or moving water, we really want to do something representative, which means getting out there into that stream as best we can and doing our sampling. I recommend folks sample on the upstream side because boots tend to kick up mud and sediments. If we're sampling out of a pond or a lake, then I recommend that you get out into deeper water if you can. You know, I've even found myself laying on a boat dock previously to get out over the water to get a sample. We're trying for a representative sample, so what we recommend is that samples be pulled from an area halfway between the surface of the water and the bottom. You know, things tend to collect on the surface and then they settle down to the bottom of the lake. So if you're testing in the middle, you get a much more representative sample, which is essentially what you want. If we're testing from, again, municipalities, there's really no need for that unless you have questions about the distribution system. Okay, so let me see here. Most of the time, whenever you collect samples, you're going to get your bottles from a lab. You're going to work with the lab ahead of time. Most labs will have their own sample bottles they will want you to use. So find the lab. Again, if there's any question about that, you know, Lisa and her colleagues, I'm sure, would be very willing to help with locating those across your state. Make sure that you don't rinse that bottle before sampling. And whenever we're taking samples, there is a process that we recommend. Sanitize that rim or your spigot. Run the water for at least 3 to 5 minutes because you're sampling the source of the water, not what you want to, not what's running in the pipes. Fill the sample jar quickly, close it, and get it to the lab on ice as quickly as you can, being very cognizant of how close you are to the lab. And there's a lot to be said about technique. I work, of course, in extension, so I work with growers quite a bit. And I always remember I got a call one time from a grower that he said, "Scott, I pulled a water test and the lab says they've never seen anything this bad. Can you help me?" So I went out to his farm and we started talking about pulling the samples and how he had done it. So I asked him, I said, you know, where did we get this sample? And he points over to a hydrant and he says, "I got it from that hydrant over there." So I thought, you know, it wouldn't be professional of me to not clarify. So I asked him, you know, is it the hydrant over here with the 50 feet of garden hose connected to it? "Yeah, that's the hydrant," he says. So I ask again, you know, is this the hydrant with the 50 feet of garden hose that's lying in the dust by your driveway? "Yeah, that one. The one with 50 feet of garden hose lying in the dust in your driveway beside this pen of feeder pigs. That's the one. Well, how did you pull this sample?" He says, "Well, I turned it on, I grabbed the end of the hose, I shot it into my sample bottle, and I sent it to the lab." I think I see the problem. So when we actually sanitize the rim of the spigot, you know, you can either flame it or put a little bleach on it, run the water, do a quick grab sample, which means opening the sample bottle or jar, filling it as quickly as possible and closing it and getting it to the lab quickly. When we did that and used the proper procedure, no detectable E. coli, no contamination whatsoever. So, you know, I tend to harp on this because there is a lot to be said for technique if you're testing water and, you know, how you pull your samples. Where do you go for testing? We recommend that you use a certified lab, one that's been certified by your state or local environmental agencies or third-party accreditors. Be certain that the lab can provide the test you need. Produce safety rule originally specified EPA method 1603 as the method to be used. Now they've provided some other alternative tests that can be used. So there's about 8 of those right now that you can use. But make sure you know what test the lab can provide and make sure it's the one you need. In general, you're going to be testing for generic E. coli. And make sure the lab provides sampling instructions. They should provide instructions for acceptable sampling containers, hold time, storing, transport expectations. Every lab is a little bit different in what they require. So make sure, the key is to communicate with that lab prior to pulling the sample and taking it to them. Okay, how are my samples tested? There are several methods that are used, and if we have any microbiologists listening tonight, let me apologize up front for this oversimplification of the process that I'm about to give you. Essentially what happens is that you'll take your water sample to the lab. They will take a subsample of that and grow it out or plate it out in some manner, or count the bacteria in there in some manner. Generally, it's plating on a Petri dish. The idea is that after incubation, you can count colonies on that Petri dish, and that tells you what the population of bacteria are in your sample. Generally, it's going to be some type of selective media so that only the E. coli or whatever we're testing for is going to grow. So that's really an oversimplification. But when you do have water tested, if you're covered by the produce safety rule, really you're looking at generic E. coli is the established indicator. Remember that it's impossible for us to test every ounce of water that goes onto our crops or that's used on our farms. So we have to pull a representative sample. And we really can't, it becomes very expensive and difficult to test samples for all known pathogens. So through the produce safety rule, FDA has basically indicated that they prefer or require generic E. coli as our indicator. What that means is you're going to test that water for generic E. coli with the understanding that if high levels of generic E. coli or any E. coli in there is found, that means there's a pretty good chance there could be other contaminants in that water, because we know when we see higher generic E. coli levels that there's a strong probability we're going to see some of these other organisms that could cause human disease. Test results. Water testing results are generally expressed as colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water. So again, at the lab, they're going to take part of your sample and test it, and then they're going to adjust those numbers so that they are in terms of 100 milliliters of water. So remember we said they're basically going to count colonies on the Petri dish. The assumption is that each colony starts from one bacterium. So we refer to those as colony forming units. So essentially that's bacteria or colony forming units per 100 mils of water. So if I test a subsample of 1 milliliter and I get 5 colonies, then I would report that as 500 colony forming units per 100 mils of water. So again, the CFU per 100 mil is just basically a way to standardize reporting, to standardize what we get back from the lab on our test. For those of you who are covered by the produce safety rule, again, this is something that we don't talk a lot about, simply because these rules are kind of in flux, and it's FDA has granted some extensions on time for compliance with some of these requirements. But in general, if you're testing water, if you're covered by the produce safety rule, you're required to produce or develop a profile or several tests, of which the geometric mean can't exceed 126 colony forming units per 100 mil, and the statistical threshold value cannot exceed 410 CFU generic E. coli per 100 mil. So again, that's about as much math as I want to throw at you guys tonight, understanding that not everyone is covered by the produce safety rule, and that if you have additional questions, Lisa and the extension folks there at UMass are always more than willing to answer questions and help you work through that. Isn't that right? See her nodding her head. All right. Okay, so question, what about a bad water test result? The thing to remember is that for the most part, a bad test will not put you out of business. A bad test merely indicates an additional risk factor to be mitigated. Now, if it's a bad test, would I want to hold off using water or irrigating in any quantity until I figured out what the problem was? So you better believe it. But I run across growers occasionally that have this fear that if they do test their water, well, what if it comes back bad? What does that do? Will it put me out of business? No, it basically points to a risk factor that you need to mitigate in some fashion. Produce safety rule, for those who are covered by the rule, gives 3 types of corrective measures that are allowed if the water quality profile does not meet the criteria. If basically you get a mean of more than 126 or a statistical threshold value of more than 410. Basically, your 3 corrective measures are: you can apply a time interval for microbial die-off, which means you can create an interval between your last application of irrigation water and harvest, up to 4 days. And what we assume is a half a log die-off per day, to the crop if there is any contamination. So again, that's one corrective measure. To be perfectly honest, it's probably not my favorite corrective measure, just simply because in a lot of cases, environmental fluctuations may or may not give us that half a log per day die-off like we think we're going to get. I know in Indiana, and I assume Massachusetts as well, your climate's probably fairly variable in that you have a lot of moisture and dew fall, and you're not in an arid climate, obviously, where you're getting 4% humidity and it's not going to rain for a little while. You can kind of predict that. But your second option is to reinspect the water system to identify problems and make necessary changes and confirm effectiveness. So this is one of those I kind of chuckle. Who knew? You pull a bad water test, you find the problem, you fix it, and then you confirm that you fixed it. Pretty pretty logical there, right? And then the other option would be to treat the water. Water can be treated. Again, in our area where we are permitted to work with our state environmental and regulatory agencies to treat wells if there are issues. Surface water can also be treated. Irrigation water can be treated in line with chlorine compounds, labeled parasitic compounds. So it is possible, although, it's not necessarily our cheapest option in a lot of cases. I would caution that we always use a labeled product and follow label directions. One of these days, I will get through an extension presentation without pointing out that with regard to pesticides, the label is the law. That's not going to happen tonight. But again, remember that sanitizers are considered, they fall under the Fungicide, Insecticide, Rodenticide Act, so they are treated as pesticides, which means that you do need to follow all the label directions when using these compounds. So with that, I can see that I am about 4 minutes over. So I will stop sharing the screen here and we'll open it up to any questions you guys might have.
I'll go ahead and throw out just to Michael, if you wanted to just briefly touch on, Scott had mentioned the regulations for water testing and water testing frequency, and I wondered if you would just quickly talk about the the regulations, the produce safety regulations in Massachusetts, when those come into effect, and when, how frequently people should be testing their water, and if it's the same for the voluntary audit program, Commonwealth Quality.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, we are in terms of the regulations in support of the adoption of the federal rule and the produce safety regulation in Massachusetts, we're obviously in alignment with the FDA codes, who are waiting on further guidance for that subpart. In particular, if there's going to be any changes to, the current water rule as was included in the initial law. So for that, we're staying pat until we get further direction. We don't plan on deviating from the federal rule. We'll remain consistent with that regulatory framework when it's released. For the Commonwealth Quality Program that is referenced now in our regulations, we will currently be still supporting the 3 tests per year for surface water, 2 for ground, and then a record of your municipal water test if you are using municipal water. As part in alignment with other gap audit programs. So that's currently what we're doing. So we are having some difficulty with the audit program this year, with farms just not having their water tests available. That might have to do with everything going on with COVID and labor shortages and those sort of situations. So we're working through it with farms and with buyers, where buyers have been up to this point understanding that there's some lapses in required paperwork and those sort of things. So we haven't had really any issues with market access currently.
And well, I'll point out also that I sent to the folks who had registered earlier enough for me to have sent out the list of some helpful resources to go along with this program. There was on there, and I'll send it out again to everyone who's on, me 12 times. And I'll send it out again to everyone who's registered. The list of resources, which include a video on how to take water samples that I think was from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, but also our website, which includes a link to Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection database of labs, as well as a map of all of the water labs and which tests to ask for. And I would always recommend that you call the lab that you plan to use and make sure that they still are running that test, and how much it costs, and what their turnaround time is between pulling the sample and delivering it to the lab. So I can include, again, I'll send that list of resources out to everyone who's on today. And then I'll just say, there was one question in the chat, which Don Tocco from the Produce Safety Alliance answered very well, but I'll just put it out to Scott in case he wants to add anything else. Someone had asked just if you test for total coliform or E. coli, and then total coliform, and then you follow with E. coli, or if you just go to generic E. coli. But Don's answer was helpful in sort of drawing that out a little bit, where he said, yes, you want to go generic E. coli is what you're looking for when you're testing a sample. But he did say that other than well water, total coliforms are not tested. Totals are an indication of surface water intrusion into wells, which is the reason they're used for well water that's used as drinking water. So that was sort of a helpful clarification about that. But yeah, you want generic E. coli. And I don't know if Scott or Michael, you want to add anything?
Yeah, you've pretty much, you've nailed it. Yeah, you want FDA, through produce safety rule has said generic E. coli is the indicator. There are provisions where you can use an alternative indicator, but the condition is that you also need to have valid scientific research, validation more or less to show to show why you've made that decision. You can deviate from that, if you wanted, you can use bacteroides or anything, or something else as an indicator, but the provision is that you need to have some type of valid research to back up that decision and demonstrate why you deviated.
Great. So if anyone has any other questions, just pop them in the chat and I can either answer or redirect them as we go along, but I do want to, in the interest of time, move along. Thank you so much, Scott, for that explanation about some water testing and the risks to water and what you might be looking for. And I think all of that will be a really good, helpful lead in to Phil's presentation. So we have Phil Tocco from Michigan State University who's going to kind of walk us through an inspection of a water system. And there you are, Phil. Looks like you're still muted.
Yeah, I'm actually going to turn my camera off in a second here because
Great.
of there being issues with my connection. I got dropped like 3 times in a 1-hour presentation, not 5 minutes, or like
yeah.
just the last hour.
Well,
So I
if we
don't want to
lose
do
you,
that to you guys.
wait for
Well,
you
it's good to see you, Phil. Phil, it's good to see your face, however.
Well, for now anyway. Okay. So I want to kind of give you guys a sort of a little bit of a farm tour, if you will. We're going to start. This is a farm. It's actually a blueberry farm. What I've done is we're going to walk through this farm's wells and things, and we'll try and give you a little bit of information and see about applying it as we speak. Now, I know a lot of you, some of you are from doing inspections, whether you're from the federal side or the state side. So we're going to start at 0 and work our way forward to kind of give folks a little bit of an idea about sort of how to look through or work through food safety around wells and building sort of the water system inspection. So to begin with, ooh, doggone it. There we go. Try again. There. So to begin with, we think about it subpart E. You've got the all ag water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And then there's this provision: you must inspect all your agricultural water systems to the extent that you're under your control, including consideration of the following. You've got that nature of each agricultural water source, the extent of your control, that degree of protection, the use of adjacent and nearby land, the likelihood of introduction of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. So all of these things are things you need to think about when you're doing this ag water inspection, this annual water system inspection. And it's, if you think about it, this stuff doesn't change a whole lot from year to year. It's pretty static. If you've got a well, and I have a well this year, it's on my property, and by gosh, it's the same well I had last year and the same well I had the year after that. Nothing's changed around it. Doggone it, why do I have to do this every year? And part of the reason they do this, I believe, this is Phil Tocco thinking as Phil Tocco, private citizen, and not anyone that, is the fact that this is really meant to be, I think, a way to signal, wait a minute, there's something, there might be something, if something changes, I need to pay attention to this. And I think that's why these criteria are so fairly generic. But there's some ways to think about your water system and looking at a water system inspection that I think really adds a lot of value to you as a grower. And so we'll kind of walk through some of those things. And I'm going to encourage you to look at some of the references that Lisa sent out earlier today, because on there we've taken the Produce Safety Alliance grower training, the Produce Safety Alliance's boilerplate log sheet for a water system inspection. We added a few columns to it that align with this subpart E sort of criteria, so you can kind of break that down a little bit. And maybe at the end, once we've walked through this water system, we can kind of see how we would fill that form out given the water system that we're going to present here. So when it comes to basic well design, I realize some of you are growers and this is going to be like, are you kidding me? But some of you who maybe don't have a lot of familiarity with wells, we need to think about what's a well and what's a relay and those kinds of things. So all wells need a source of power. So whether that's a gasoline, like a diesel engine or gasoline, they need a source of power to actually power the well. They need the pump that where the power goes to draw water. And then they need a method to regulate flow. This is the barest minimum. If I was thinking about a well, these are the 3 base components. There are other additions like air bladders and backflow preventers and concrete pads that are all really nice to have and improve the efficacy or the efficiency of that well. But the real base things are really a source of power, a pump to draw the water, and a method to regulate flow. I say this because when I was fairly new in my role, there were a lot of times I was looking at basically a hydrant and I was thinking, oh, that's a well. And I'm like, no, I need to think a little bit differently, and I need to look for those 3 things. And if there's not, those 3 things aren't present, what I'm probably looking at is a relay or some kind of something that is not a well. So make sure you have that sort of in your head as you're looking at things to make sure that you're not, it helps to build credibility. I'll just put it that way. So with respect to a good well is always above grade. It has intact concrete if the concrete is present. So typically when a well is installed, they usually put a layer of bentonite around the outside well casing of the well. And that bentonite, if you're familiar with bentonite, it's a clay, and the clay absorbs water. And as long as that clay is dry, it stays put. But when it gets wet, it swells. And that's why they put it there, is because that way it'll swell and keep that well really nice and tight. Well, if there's a lot of water that's infiltrating and then it's drying out, that bentonite will swell and then it'll contract, and it'll swell and it'll contract. And if there's a concrete pad over top of it, the concrete pad serves as an early warning device that there's a potential problem with the well. So in this case, this has got a nice intact concrete pad there. And so we know that the bentonite is not, there's no water infiltrating into the bentonite. And so that's, like I say, an early warning sign that the well's potentially being infiltrated. It also, another important piece of a good well is a securely connected conduit. And so you've got that conduit going, I can't even show you because I don't have a really good pointer here. I don't think you can even see my pointer. That you see that big square box, and you got that big tube that goes into that square box. That's the conduit. It's securely connected to the well, and it's securely locked. It has a screen vent hole, so that typically what happens with pumps is they're sucking water out of the ground. When you take something out of the ground, you end up needing to have water to put back, or air to put back into that space. So you need the vent hole so that it'll allow for the water removal. And then a good well also has a backflow preventer. It's another major thing to have there as well. So those are the main components of a good well. Now, if we look at in this farm, we're going to go on farm now. And so this is a blueberry farm that's actually in Michigan. Now I've changed the wells and protecting the innocent. So this is the wells that we're going to look at are not on this farm. You have to understand that up front. So if we look at our first water system, it has a wellhead, and the wellhead is broken, feeds 3 blocks. And then there's a 4th block that's fed by a pond. So there's 2 wells on this property. And the first well, let's see if it'll let me do this. I'm going to move you. Sorry about that. I got to rearrange my screen a bit. Okay, our first irrigation. So our block 1 has an irrigation, has a sensor, pressure gauge, and so typically with the pressure gauge tells us whether or not that particular block is leaking or if there's a problem in that block. So typically it runs at about 40 psi, that being an optimum pressure for this drip line. So in this case, the drip, when we look at the pressure gauge, we see the pressure gauge is at 0. So what could potentially be going wrong in this block to cause the pressure to drop completely down to 0? You can talk. You can unmute and talk, can't you? Or did Lisa?
Oh no, they can unmute if they want, or if they're shy, pop an answer in the chat box.
Gotcha.
Any ideas, anyone?
Why would the pressure go to 0? I can't see the chat, so someone's gonna have to read it. It won't let me.
Nothing yet.
A leak in the line.
Oh, you do see my pointer. Okay, good. Okay.
Get that answer, Phil?
What's that?
Someone had suggested a leak in the line.
A leak in the line is indeed.
Gauge, someone else just suggested.
Say that again about the gauge.
A plugged gauge.
Plugged gauge would definitely do it too. So typically, if we have a 0, like if there's no pressure here, that means no water's getting to the sensor. So typically, that would mean that if there's a plug, it would be the on the well side or on the beginning flow side of the pressure sensor. So, or it could also be no electricity, a generator issue, absolutely malfunction in the pump. It could also mean that some of the drip line got clipped on the other side of the well. If you think about it being the well, the sensor, and then the block, on the block side, there could be something where something was clipped and there's basically a running water in the block. and therefore there's no pressure in the system. Or it could be a plug on the well side of the pressure sensor. So definitely all of those are important. Using these sensors, using these pressure gauges, you can at least segment where the issues are. And that becomes really important as you start to work through and think through problems when they occur. Absolutely. So that's our first pressure gauge in our first block. So if we go to the wellhead, this is the first wellhead that feeds the first three. Oh wait, no, we're going, that's weird. I should have gone to a wellhead. I don't know where it went. That'll come up. So with the irrigation pipe to block 2, we see that the pressure is fine. So there's no problem here, right? So that's a good thing. So this is our first wellhead. Well, I'll go back to wellhead 1, but can you guys see wellhead number 2? We've got a couple of shots here. So I said a good wellhead has secure conduit pipe, secure conduit, has maybe a concrete pad, and is secure. So what are the good things about this well? Start there.
Above ground.
It's above ground, absolutely. So is there anything bad with this well? Is the conduit secure?
Have conduit, you can open wires.
No, exactly. The wires are wide open, right? So that's something that the grower would probably need to want to fix. It's not sealed at all. So that means critters can actually walk down into that hole and get stuck there. And it's been known to have things like earwigs get in there and actually cause spikes in E. coli. So we want to make sure that we plug that hole and find a way to seal it up nice and tight. So that's definitely an issue, but it is above ground. Another thing that I like about this well, I know it does have a backflow preventer here. It's not real evident, but it's right there. And it does have something, one thing I didn't put on my list is having posts so that you don't accidentally run over the well. As dumb as that sounds, I've done that myself, and it's not a fun experience. I don't wish that on anyone to have to fix a well that they ran over with their vehicle. So real quick, I'm going to go back to well 1 because we totally missed wellhead 1. Here we go. So this is wellhead 1. This is the one that feeds a portion of those blocks. Okay, this is a relatively new wellhead, and you guys, if you see me flipping through it, you'll see that there's a number of things. So what's good about this well?
All the components are intact.
Okay, all the components are intact.
No.
Okay. So is there anything that could be improved on this well?
You can put a concrete pad and you can protect it with some posts.
Sure, absolutely. Those are definitely ways we can improve this well. So I guess what I want to kind of point out to people is even when you've got a really good well, there's always one more thing you can do. And even when you have a really bad well, there's always one more thing you can do. And it's important to think through that and really keep that in mind. It's not saying that, I mean, in some cases there may be things that you really need to fix, like having an open conduit, like having no conduit or having basically open wires. But in situations where you've got nothing that would cause an inspector a lot of heartburn, there's still some things you can do to make it better. And it's important to think about this as a continuum and a continuous process. And I guess that's where I was really getting at with this, is to really think about it as a continuous process. I'll jump back to where we were. Okay. And so now we're going to go to block 3, if it'll let us. I'm still getting used to this program. I've never done it live before. So, okay. So in wellhead 3, our irrigation pipe for block 3, we see that our pressure gauge is now up to 60. Okay, 60 PSI. So now we have elevated pressure. So what might be going on to cause elevated pressure?
Plugged line or a crimped line.
Right. So a crimped line or plugged line on the block side versus the well side, right? So if we have a blocked line on the well side, it's going to cause lower than normal pressure. And if we have a plugged line on the block side, it's going to cause elevated pressure. So ways to think about this that way. Is there anything else that might cause this? How about a stuck pressure gauge? If a pressure gauge is busted. So this is why it's important to check the pressure gauges routinely, like once a year or so, just to make sure that they're working properly. It's in part, it could be, and that's true of the other one too, making sure that they're working properly is fairly important, so that way you can sense when there's a problem and get to it right away. So it's kind of important. Now, the other thing that's fairly unique to blueberry fields in Michigan is most of them have an on-site pond and a pump for the pond, because typically what they'll do is there's high iron in the water that's in our wells in Michigan. So typically they'll pump irrigation water from a well into the pond so that the iron will settle out, and then they'll pump from the pond into the drip irrigation. So in this case, it draws from a spring-fed pond, and water use from this is considered surface water under the rule. So what could the grower do to still use his water source but minimize the exposure to the rule? So you've learned about application. I'm sure many of you know about application and timing in terms of risk reduction. So how could they change the application and the timing to make this safer? Let me put it another way. How could I use this water and then not have to sample it for the produce safety rule?
Drip irrigation.
Drip irrigation, you betcha. Thanks, Brent. So so that would be a way to kind of get at that. If the way we use this water can change the way we approach things. And it's important too, as a grower, to think about all of the different ways I use water, because sometimes I'll say, I only use, so in many blueberry fields, they have both overhead irrigation as well as drip irrigation. And to a person, I've always heard growers say, I never use the overhead irrigation except for frost protection. Well, lo and behold, occasionally, sometimes we have frosts in the middle of July and August. And this would be a situation, not really, I'm just being silly. But what happened was, as I'm driving down the road in July in blueberry country, and sure enough, yes, they have drip irrigation in this block, but then they're also running the overhead irrigation. It's been so dry that they needed to do both to get enough water on this field. So it's important when we think about the way we use water to think about not only those times when the way we always use water, but in sort of those 100-year sort of I never use it except for that one time. We need to consider that one time with respect to risk. So it's really important to think about all the ways we use water, even in those, sort of like when heck freezes over, those sort of periods. And so this grower would need to consider, okay, he's using pond water for this. That all of a sudden now becomes not only a surface water source, but it's then covered by the rule, and I got to do 5 samples a year or have a good microbial water quality profile on it. So that kind of gives it sort of all of that. So if we're thinking about all of these sources, if we're looking at that sheet, okay, and we think about if we're looking strictly at the specifics that FSMA outlines, what would be let's go back to that first line there. If we go back to here, so what is the nature of each agricultural water source? What do we have? We have 2 wells and a pond, right? So what are they? Honest, it's not a trick question.
Groundwater and surface water.
Right. So we have groundwater and surface water. There's 2 groundwater sources and 1 surface water source. What's the extent of the control based on what you saw? Was there a high degree of control or a low degree of control? Let's talk about that a little bit. So if we're talking about a well, okay, and the well is on the property, in the center of the property. Let me see if I can go back. Dang, I wish I could do 2 things at once here, and it won't let me. So if we're talking about a well in the middle of the property, can we control that really well?
Yes.
Right. So, and then if we're talking about, see, you got me at the end of the night. That's the problem. So I'm asking for all these like call-in responses. So, so that's one thing right there. But if I have a well that's at the edge of the property, would I have more control over that well or less control over that well? Right, less. Right. These are not tricks. We're just walking through the kind of the thought process here. So now if I have a pond, do I have more control of that pond versus the well, or do I have less control over the pond versus the well?
Less on the pond.
Less on the pond, you betcha. So there's no good quantitative way to say what kind of extent of control other than high, medium, and low. So you need to be thinking in terms of sort of relative risk here in terms of filling that out. Then the next one, the third, is the degree of protection for each agricultural water source. So how protected is the well versus the pond? Which one would be more protected, the pond or the well?
Well,
The well, okay. And then we look at the use of adjacent and nearby land. So this is a farm that's a blueberry farm that is surrounded by other blueberry farms. So actually, let's see if we can't go back to the Google Earth and then we can show it. I'm trying to move some stuff around so I can, here we go. If we go back to our map and we look around, and I'm going to have us move the well around so you can kind of see to the right, and you see a lot of open land, and then you move down here. How likely, what are there likely known or reasonably foreseeable contaminants in the stuff that you're seeing around?
I see no animal operations, and I'll give you a hallelujah to your call and response.
Oh, great. Thank you, Don. Thank you. I feel so special. No, yeah. There's no animal operations. The only thing that I could find that's even a little bit suspect is over here to the north. If we zoomed in, you'd see it's like a construction thing or something. And I was couldn't figure out what it was, but you could see there's a construction area here. This is kind of the way, if you're an inspector, you're doing this before you go out to a farm. If you're a grower, you already know this stuff. I mean, you've traveled you've traveled around the countryside. You know how things are going, but sometimes, you may not realize how close things are. So looking at things from the lens of a Google Earth will give you the opportunity to really explore things a little bit better, maybe in a different perspective anyway. So I'd encourage a grower to see sort of an overhead view as well. And then the last one then is the likelihood of introduction of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. What kind of likelihood do we have in those wells of introduction of known or reasonably foreseeable hazards?
not a heck of a
Not much, right? Probably a little bit more on the well that needs to have its conduit sealed up or that needs conduit in the first place. And then the other one probably is pretty good. How about the pond?
always a nightmare.
Yep.
Bird activity.
Bird activity is a big deal and certainly something to think about. So yeah, that's kind of the thought process in putting together the water system inspection. It's really meant to be a really high level, at least as I understand it. It's meant to be a high level, and it's really meant to give you some red flags like, oh, this is something I need to worry about. So be thinking about it that way. So that's all I have. So my question to you is, does anyone have any questions?
Nothing in the chat. Does anyone have any, thank you so much for Phil for running us through that, and to the folks who were brave and chimed in. I just really want to thank everybody for coming tonight and being a part of the program, and all of the speakers. that shared all these great slides and information with folks.